History likes its villains neat, clean cuts, sharp crowns, dramatic exits. But Henry VIII? He didn't ride off into the sunset. He didn't even get a regal fade out. Nope. England's most infamous monarch exited this world like spoiled meat left too long in the sun, bloated, festering, and terrifying everyone stuck in the room with him. This is the story of Henry VIII's final days, where a man once hailed as the Golden Renaissance Prince became a monster who couldn't stand, couldn't sleep, and whose very body seemed to turn against him. Patriot or tyrant, lover or butcher. In the end, he was mostly just rotting. Not slain on the battlefield, not toppled by rivals, just undone by his own flesh. And hey, if you like what we uncover in the dark, hit like and subscribe so I know to keep digging. Picture this: young Henry, 6'2", athletic, dazzling, the very image of Renaissance royalty. A king who jousted, hunted, composed music, even wrote poetry. Think less grumpy old tyrant and more Tudor golden boy. But fast forward 3 decades and 6 wives later, and that golden glow has curdled into something far darker. By the 1540s, Henry's body was failing spectacularly. Years of jousting injuries left him unable to move without pain. Ulcers bloomed on his legs like unholy flowers, weeping and foul-smelling. Courtiers gagged behind embroidered sleeves. The once sleek figure had swollen into obesity, padded with nearly 400 pounds of royal flesh. What had once been a prince of Europe was becoming a spectacle. A king wrapped in silk and jewels on the outside, but collapsing into ruin on the inside. But behind the spectacle, the truth was harder to perfume. Silk can hide a body, but it can't hide rot. It wasn't just his size. Henry was a walking catalogue of slow-motion disaster. His ulcerated legs throbbed and oozed daily. Servants dressed the wounds, but nothing stopped the rot. Some whispered the stench carried across entire rooms. Others swore the king's temper soured with his flesh. Every ulcer another excuse for cruelty. Historians debate whether it was diabetes, Cushing's, or untreated infections. But whatever the diagnosis, the reality was clear. His body was betraying him. Just imagine a kingdom forced to obey a man whose mere presence carried the smell of decay. And here's the twist: Henry's suffering made him more dangerous, not less. Pain sharpened his paranoia, and paranoia sharpened his cruelty. Where once he was charming, now he was volcanic. His courtiers learned to read his moods the way sailors scan storm clouds. One wrong word, and you were overboard. For the attendants who served him, the task was heavy with fear as much as duty. To care for Henry in his decline was to walk a delicate line, showing compassion without appearing disloyal, obeying his commands while silently witnessing his weakness. They knew the king's temper had not faded, even as his strength did, and each day in his chambers carried an unspoken tension. To stand near him was to feel both the weight of his crown and the shadow of his mortality. By this stage, Henry was on his 6th wife, poor Catherine Parr. Unlike the others, she managed to outlive him. But don't mistake survival for safety. Even in his decline, Henry's suspicions grew razor-sharp. Catherine once dared to debate religion with him, only to find herself the target of an arrest warrant. Picture it: the Queen, suddenly accused of heresy, realizing the king's love could flip into death at the twitch of a quill. Only quick thinking and some well-placed tears convinced Henry that she'd only been humbly learning from his superior wisdom. The warrant was quietly shelved. Catherine lived, barely. But the episode proved something chilling. Even at the end, Henry's shadow was enough to terrify everyone around him. His body might have been rotting, but his grip on power hadn't loosened. By 1546, Henry's condition left him almost immobile. His massive frame had to be hoisted by mechanical contraptions just to reach his throne. He could barely ride, barely walk, barely even sleep. The once golden king, conqueror of France and terror of Rome, was now a prisoner of his own flesh. yet he demanded to be obeyed as fiercely as ever. Imagine a banquet where the host sits sweating, bleeding from bandaged legs, barking orders with breath that smelled faintly of rot, and everyone smiling as if nothing was wrong. That was Tudor court life in Henry's last years. And if you think the courtiers pitied him, think again. They feared him. The worse his condition got, the sharper his cruelty became. Executions didn't slow down, they sped up. He burned Protestants. He hanged Catholics. To Henry, mercy was weakness. And weakness was something he couldn't afford to show. Here's the irony. The man who made an empire kneel was terrified of kneeling before death. In January 1547, Henry's health crashed. Fever, agony, ulcers worsening. He could barely breathe. Physicians, terrified of being executed for failure, muttered nonsense remedies. And yet, no one dared to speak the truth. It was treason to tell the king he was dying. Even as he lay drenched in sweat, trembling with fever, his doctors danced around the obvious. It wasn't until a priest was finally brought to hear his last confession that Henry allowed the words, yes, he was leaving this world. But here's the chilling detail. Even in confession, Henry never asked forgiveness for his cruelty. He clung to his divine right until the end, insisting he'd ruled as God's anointed. Maybe he believed it. Maybe he just couldn't face the alternative. And if he refused to humble himself in life, then perhaps death would do it for him. Henry died in the early hours of January 28, 1547. But death didn't end the horror, it only amplified it. His enormous corpse was too large for his coffin. As the funeral procession moved, the bloated body began to leak. Chroniclers claimed dogs lapped at the fluid that seeped onto the church floor. Others dismissed it as rumor. But whether true or not, the image stuck. England's once great king dissolving into something less than human. Even in death, Henry couldn't escape spectacle. The man who once dined like a god became dinner for worms. Poetic justice? Maybe. After all, he ruled with cruelty, paranoia, and bloodshed. Was it really surprising that his body betrayed him as brutally as he betrayed his people? Perhaps his body was simply catching up to the darkness of his reign. So what do we make of Henry VIII's final act? Was it divine justice, the mighty king reduced to stinking ruin, or just another chapter in the endless brutality of history? What we know is this: Henry left behind a country permanently reshaped by his whims, the English Reformation, a trail of executed wives, ministers, and rivals, a monarchy both feared and unstable, and an image burned into history, a king who began as a Renaissance ideal and ended as a bloated tyrant who rotted before the world's eyes. Power doesn't just corrupt, it feasts until nothing human remains. In the end, Henry's rotting body mirrored the decay of his mind. Flesh, power, conscience, all collapsing into ruin together. If you enjoyed this tale and want to uncover more shadows of history, subscribe to the Waxenvein Ledger. History is full of nightmares, and we've only just started turning the pages.